Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second session for the 2023 Year of the Community Table series. We just want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Anthem Medicaid, for making this training possible, not only by allowing us to host it, but also allowing it to be free for any and all who register. And today we have with us Miss Katie League, who is going to be talking to us about the introduction to serious mental illness. Katie, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here with you all. I am so excited to share with you a little bit about my experience. As mentioned, my name is Katie League. I am a clinical social worker. I am located in Maryland, and I have worked for, almost 2 decades in homeless services, primarily here in Baltimore, Maryland. Both as prior to becoming a social worker, and then for 15 years as a social worker. My work has primarily been outreach, community engagement. I launched our mobile clinic and community health worker programs here in Baltimore. And so I spent most of my time outside of the healthcare for the homeless. So I am currently the clinical policy manager at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. The council is based in Tennessee, but we have staff everywhere across the country. And I'm very fortunate that they hire people with the experience of working in health centers. And so I come with my experience primarily from Baltimore, as I said. And so I'll be coming to you with that experience. I welcome you. I would love for you to use the Q&A feature to directly ask questions. I'm going to do my best to monitor it. You also can use the chat. I will be honest, I'm not always great at maneuvering between 2 things. So I've asked my amazing hosts to, if there's something that is there that needs to be flagged, they will interrupt. I have no problem with that. This is designed for you. I want this to be a useful, constructive hour of your time. I want you to be able to take away things that can be applicable and used today in your work. The best way you can help me do that is to ask those questions. And I'm also happy to follow up after the fact. So if you have any questions about the council's work or other topics or things that you would like to learn more about, please let me know. We also are, one of the great things I love about the council, in addition to doing this amazing amount of work and having health centers across the country, we do have quite a few virtual trainings that are available on our website. So if there are topics that are not covered in this series that you have, although you have a great list of topics that are going to be covered, but if there are other things that you're interested in or want to delve deeper in, we very well may have them available on our website, or that I'd love to hear where they are because maybe we need to have them. So always looking to learn from you all who are working directly in the community about what your needs are. That's why we are here. We really are here to help be a part of the movement to end homelessness, and we do that in the work through our health centers. So today we're going to be talking about serious mental illness. As a clinical social worker, I have professional training in this, but my work has been primarily about working with outreach workers, community health workers, staff who are not professionally trained, but very often are the individuals that are connecting most with people experiencing homelessness, and very often are the ones who are going to notice changes in behaviors and moods, and what person's lives are like on their day-to-day, and can be really great resources for identifying changes or concerns. We're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about how to actually address crisis situations, those acute crises, and what you can do as a non-clinically trained person. There's a lot of things that you can do and a lot of information you could have that could make you safer, make the individual safer, make sure that everybody comes out of it successfully. Just a little waiver, we at the council, we are funded through the Health Resources and Services Administration. The content that I create is not necessarily expressing their endorsement. So just a little bit of an overview, as I said, here's what I hope to accomplish in the next 55 minutes. I'm going to do a little bit of level setting on terms. I'm going to try really hard not to go into too many clinical terms because they're not really necessary. However, I want you to become aware of them and make sure that you're able to associate what they might mean. We're going to talk a little bit about those very specific terms. I will talk about some of the conditions that get identified typically when somebody talks about serious mental illness. How homelessness impacts those serious mental illnesses. Not everybody living with a serious mental illness is homeless, and not everybody who is homeless is living with a serious mental illness. Those are two really important things to remember. They are not completely linked, but there certainly is a disproportionate representation of serious mental illness in the community of people experiencing homelessness. Going to talk a little bit about the serious mental illness and substance use. Could be an entire other full day training, really important to talk about, but definitely won't be able to cover it all in the next 55 minutes. Then finally, and really importantly, something I hope is tangible for you all, we're going to talk about what it is to de-escalate a crisis situation, what roles you can play depending on where you are coming from, and what it is that you can contribute to make sure that somebody is safe and is able to come out of the other side of that acute crisis. Little review, and then I'm going to try and do the Q&A as we go along, but certainly that'll give me a moment to take a deep breath and read quickly and make sure that I've addressed at least all of the pressing issues that you've identified. A few learning objectives for today. We're going to define what serious mental illness is. I'm going to help you identify 3 to 4 conditions that can be considered serious mental illnesses, and then describing 2 or 3 strategies for de-escalation in crisis situations. So really, I want you to have some takeaways. This isn't like going into and taking, an entire licensing course, but it's really not necessary. And the lived experience you all have in working day to day among people experiencing homelessness makes you experts in that field already. This is to help create some context for you and maybe give you a lens through which to see people you maybe have been struggling with or having frustrations with. Hopefully this will help inform your work starting immediately after you leave today. So I want to just give a little context. So nearly 1 in 5 US adults are living with a mental illness. So just think of your family size, think of the people around you. That is 20% of our population. And that is a wide array of labels or conditions that maybe they have been diagnosed with, but the prevalence is incredibly high. And as we know, with all things, that is going to be an underestimate. That is based on people who have actually received a diagnosis or have sought treatment at some point. And so we know that this is likely an undercount of the reality of what is happening. And so just a reminder, the chances are people that you are interacting with have things going on in their lives. And that is just an important reminder that what we know of a person is so little compared to what is really going on for them. These conditions vary in degrees of severity, and they range from, the clinical terms we use are often mild, moderate, and severe. But really that's just to say that no single condition, even if you understand it or you may be living with it, do you understand what that means for someone else? They vary greatly in how they manifest themselves, how they present for a person, what they are experiencing in that moment. And as with all of us, with every health condition we may have in the course of our lives, it fluctuates in terms of how we are experiencing it on that day. To that point, and this is so incredibly important, if you walk away with something, this is one of the things I really hope you take away, that mental health is like any other health condition that can benefit from but not be cured by medication. So mental health is a health condition. People are not wrong. They are not defective. They are not to blame for their mental health. And it should be talked about and accepted just as any other health condition is. However, we live in a world in which it continues to be stigmatized, continues to be talked about less. We certainly would never, judge somebody for taking an inhaler for their asthma or not taking their medication, if they have diabetes or high blood pressure. These are all very common things, many of which are congenital, meaning they were born with it or it just happened to them. It has absolutely nothing to do with any actions they've taken. That's really important to note, just like mental health. Mental health, nobody caused it to themselves. We will talk a little bit about how the environment in which a person lives and the world around us can cause some mental health conditions, particularly when we talk about trauma, but it is no individual's fault. And then underlying to all this, and there is so much racism in healthcare in general, in mental health in particular, and the ways in which this impacts a person's accessing treatment, being able to, be seen as a human and not just their condition, will inform the trajectory of their life in ways that are incredibly impactful. And this remains a real issue. People experiencing homelessness, or excuse me, people living with mental illness there are more white people than people of color living with mental illness. However, that is probably at least in part due to the fact of underdiagnosis among communities of color because of that stigma, and also just the ways in which our systems are set up that make it difficult for them to access treatment. In addition, there are far too many people that look like me that are providing mental health care, which is okay, and I like to believe that I do it well, but that there are not enough people of color that are in positions where they can be providing healthcare to individuals. Many want to see somebody who looks like them when they are seeking care, and that is completely understandable and very often a resource that is not available in all communities. So just going over some basic definitions here. So just talking about mental illness is a very broad category of mental, behavioral, or emotional disorders. They can really vary in impact, ranging and using that mild, moderate, and severe impairments. So when we talk about serious mental illnesses, they are defined as mental, behavioral, or emotional disorders resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits a person one or more major life activities. So it is less about the title or the descriptor that is given, but more about how it impacts a person's function and their ability to do their day-to-day life. Sometimes this is also identified by how many acute crises they have that used to be monitored. Back the old way is how many times you were hospitalized. It's a really narrow way to look at it. We know that people don't seek medical care for a lot of reasons, and that doesn't mean it's because they're not in crisis. We also sadly know that very often a person may encounter police before they are able to have intervention from a medical source. And so when we think of acute crisis, we can't just think of how many times they are hospitalized, but actually how many times these conditions got to a point where they were unable to function entirely and it impacted their daily life. So it is particularly concentrated among those who experience disabilities due to those serious mental illnesses, but I would argue that any serious function impairment, whether it's for half a day or a month or a year, is significant. It may not mean that it puts them out of work or makes it so they can't do large, be register in some category as meeting disability, whether it be Social Security or some other benefit source, but really that impact on impairment and ability to live their lives in a way that they want to. So I would be remiss not to name some of the names that are often considered serious mental illnesses. As I said, anything can be a serious mental illness. It is about that impact on the person's functioning. Typically, psychotic disorders, this includes schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, major depression with or without psychosis, anxiety, and personality disorders are some of the categories that we often see when somebody has significant impact on their functioning, that they may have been diagnosed in the past or currently being treated for one of these conditions. But I really do want to emphasize that they are not limited to these conditions, that Eating disorders can be incredibly severe mental illnesses because they can drastically impact a person's ability to function daily. So there is not one thing that any condition can be severe and any condition can be mild. So many of these conditions, when managed by the individual, may fall in the mild scale, and they are able to perform most, if not all, of their activities of daily living and live a life that they are happy with. Some symptoms, these are very broad symptoms, but things that I think you all will see in your community are why it's so important to take note of these, because it's less about what the label is and more about how it is manifesting in the person's life. So individuals may be more fearful. You may see an increase in fear or paranoia, kind of thinking that people or systems are trying to harm them. This can be particularly difficult because many systems are designed to harm people. I think we should be candid about that, and the fact that they are working exactly as they are designed to, and that is to perpetuate oppression. And so it can be a fine line and very difficult to parse through, but that might be something you see. Loss of appetite or increase in appetite, more or less sleep, particularly those of you who are working in shelters or residential programs, this might be one of the big triggers that you see. In addition to being a symptom, it is also something, we're going to talk a little bit in a little while about triggers. It is something that can cause, that can trigger a more serious episode or trigger an actual crisis episode. Sleep is really important for our brains. And when we don't have it, anyone who has gone through periods of sleeplessness, whether it's due to having a baby or stress in life or whatever it might be, the impact of not having sleep on yourself. When somebody is living with mental illness, it is one of the triggers that can really exacerbate it. Racing or pressured speech, from Massachusetts, so I talk fast, so I got to know the person's baseline. But if they are talking fast or maybe talking in a way that doesn't make sense, disconnected thoughts or incomplete sentences, maybe as serious as something that we call word salad, which is exactly that. Just think of words thrown into a bowl and you're just picking one out randomly. They're not connected or conjoined in any way. Those can all be indicators that maybe a person's mental health is currently bothering them or currently experiencing a hypervigilance of symptoms. One of the obvious ones, I think this is what people very often associate when they think of the psychotic disorders, but truthfully is not nearly as prevalent or is not a symptom that appears first regularly for individuals, is responding to voices or external stimuli. This may be that they see or hear or taste or smell something that is not there. Another one that a lot of people don't think about is actually showing no emotion. We call this a flat affect. Can be due to medication, which can make it confusing, but a lot of times it can just be due to this inability to express emotions and inability to feel those emotions, and so they are not expressing them. And then one that is often leading to crisis situations is the feeling of hopelessness, and certainly something we have seen exacerbated by the pandemic, something we see regularly exacerbated by the experience of homelessness, is a person's despair and feeling of hopelessness that things are not going to change for them. I want to talk a little bit again about the stigma. So very often mental health is viewed as a personal flaw rather than a health condition. There is so much cultural stigma to admitting the problem, accessing treatment, taking medications. All of these things are viewed in different communities as failures, or as there are very often gender identity tags labeled to this. Somebody who identifies as male, it is not a manly thing to do to need help or to talk to someone. This is incredibly dangerous and very, very risky, but is a huge barrier to accessing treatment and creating safety for people. Also, again, that historic racism and trauma that led to mistrust and leads to mistrust daily in healthcare systems is going to decrease access to care. So especially in communities where there are not a wide array of options for people, if there's only one system or a few systems that are able to provide behavioral health care, if that person has had a family member, they themselves have felt mistreated by that system, they're not going to feel safe to return to them for care. So I want to put this in context. The impact on people experiencing homelessness with severe mental illness is different than a person who is housed. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a higher prevalence of people with mental health conditions among homeless individuals. There are also higher rates of co-occurring disorders, so that mental health and substance use combination. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why that is, and if you haven't taken this from me already, it is not because of a human flaw. Accessing treatment is more difficult when you are unstably housed. You may not know where you are staying. Unstably housed individuals typically have lower incomes, if any incomes at all. They are also required to live in systems where getting a bed is the priority, or a place to sleep is the priority. So needing to be in lines because the shelter opens at a certain time, or only being able to access food at certain locations, often causes a person to have to choose between food and treatment, a bed and getting their medications. So it is very, very often that treatment is far more difficult. A really important one to note is that homelessness makes existing conditions worse and can cause mental health conditions. So as I said, a person doesn't cause their mental health conditions, but that they can certainly be exacerbated by the situations and the environment in which they live. But it also can cause new mental health conditions, particularly in the areas of anxiety and trauma, depression. When somebody is experiencing homelessness, the despair for the situation in which they feel they are living, and the fear and the reality that it may be very, very difficult to get out of homelessness can cause those mental health conditions. Lack of stable housing, income, food, transportation, they all impact the efficacy of treatment. So even when a person is able to access treatment, having the lack of stable housing and income, food to be able to do that treatment, engage in that treatment completely, decreases that efficacy. If there are so many medications that have really strict rules about when you take them, with or without food, the time of day, how that medication is stored. When somebody doesn't have a refrigerator or control over when they eat, or access to be able to get their medications every time they need to, then it is going to impact the efficacy, even if they are engaged and are active participants and want to be in treatment. Now, there's a whole nother area of realm here of mandatory treatments and health insurance, which I'm happy to take into a separate conversation. Part of my work in Baltimore was about expanding Medicaid access, and that is an incredibly positive thing, but it is certainly not without barriers, even when somebody does have health insurance. Finding providers who will take it, getting your medications, copays are still barriers. So lots of things there that also impact the efficacy and likelihood that somebody is going to be able to access treatment. So as I said, homelessness makes mental health worse. And that's because homelessness causes decreased access to treatment, lost or stolen medication. So a person's belongings, especially unsheltered individuals, could be destroyed by weather, stolen or cleared during encampment sweeps. Some people believe that some of these medications, some of them do have a street value, others just see a pill bottle and think that maybe there's a chance there's a street value. So there is a currency associated with wanting to steal or take those medications. There's a lot of structural limitations to getting those replaced, even if there's a provider that would like to get them. Pharmacies have regulations around how frequently they can dispense certain medications, especially the medications that often are prescribed to people living with mental illness. And so it can be a real barrier and disruption in their treatment. A disruption in medication can be really harmful because very often these medications depend on being taken every day at a regular time, and gaps in treatment make that medication less effective when the person's able to get back on them. Living among lots of people. If you have multiple people in your house, I have 2 children. Sometimes I can tell you that feels like 200. I was fortunate enough to go to college, and so there were hundreds of people in my building. That is not an easy situation. Sharing a bedroom with one person was very stressful at times. Think of large shelters or encampments where people don't have any space that is their own. So that alone can be a stressor and very triggering to people because everybody is different. I choose to live with the people that I live with, and they can be stressful at times. Think of when you are in a shelter of maybe even hundreds of people that you did not choose to live with and have their own lives going on. Ongoing trauma, I can't talk about this enough. The experience of being homeless can be and very often is traumatic. And it is incredibly difficult to address mental health when trauma is actively happening because a person is living in this crisis state every single day. They are not able to access the parts of their brain that allow them to address some of this trauma. And their whole nervous system, their whole bodies are hyper vigilant. They're experiencing this rate of anxiety and anticipation of the uncertainty of their lives. Talked a little bit about the interruption in care that often happens, and just that overarching lack of stability in their lives can make mental health conditions worse or make their symptoms worse. So as I mentioned, these homelessness can cause new mental health symptoms. Talked all about this: depression, suicidal thoughts, trauma, anxiety, paranoia very often can be triggered by real situations that because of that trauma, somebody can't get out of their mind that it's going to happen to them or that something awful is going to happen to them. So these are all new illnesses or diagnoses that could be labeled upon somebody that are caused by their mental health and, caused by their experience of homelessness. So co-occurring disorders, this is an incredibly broad topic, and certainly many communities, most communities across the country are suffering from the opioid epidemic. There are also many communities that are struggling with meth abuse and just serious substance use that is drastically impacting and taking the lives of their community members. What we call adverse childhood experiences. This is a clinical term, but really what it refers to are things that people experience as children that were just part of their childhood. Very often fall into the category of trauma, but could be a result of simply living in a community that is in what is food apartheid. I learned this term, and I want to get it out as much as I can because I was educated on thinking about food deserts, just where you were without access to food, but those decisions are very intentional, and deserts suggest that maybe it was beyond somebody's control. They are entirely within people's control to provide adequate and healthy and fresh food to any community in the country. So it is food apartheid as we make the decisions not to make those resources available. These adverse childhood experiences lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. So this is starting as a root of a child that, as we young children do not have a say in the life in which they were born into. And so these things can impact and bend the trajectory of a person's life for their entire livelihoods. And depending on the community and how long these adverse childhood experiences extend in their life, it will inform their arc and be something that somebody has to work against, seek treatment for, change in ways that they may not have control over. And substance use is often a way of managing the symptoms a person is experiencing. So often we want to say that somebody fell into substance use or chose to do it because of some internal flaw. Very often it is because they are trying to manage symptoms that they are experiencing, And the substance plays a very effective role for a period of time in doing just that. And so it is a self-medication or a way of trying to manage those symptoms and survive and live in a way that they have access to. Can be difficult to know what is mental health and what is causing the substance use, but truthfully, it doesn't really matter. When we are talking about all of this, it is about how the person in front of you is, what they are feeling, what their experience is, and what they would like to change. It doesn't really matter for those of us who are not the ones who are going to be medically treating it, what the cause is. So just important to inform your lens as you view a person. There are a lot of things that could be contributing to why a person is doing it. It is not your job to figure out the why, but rather to know that all of these things are possible and to see it through the lens of that this was simply in many ways, in many times, a way that somebody is trying to survive, and viewing it as a strength of theirs rather than a deficit, that this person has found ways, despite all of these adverse experiences in their life and all of the hardships in which they are currently facing, they are finding a way to move forward. It might not be your preferred way or the way that you might have opinions on that. That is human of you, but it is not ours to decide if that is the best way forward for them. It is for them to decide. And if they decide it's not the best way forward, then we can join them in trying to change that, but that's not for us to decide if it's time to do that. So some conversation here about the triggers. So there are a couple that could happen internally and some external triggers for what causes somebody's symptoms to worsen. Changes in medications. So somebody who is engaged in treatment, I talked a little bit about if somebody goes on or off medication. So those changes can all impact whether or not a person starts to experience a more severe episodes or more severe symptoms than they had been experiencing. Poor sleep. As with all of us, relationships can really be triggering for what might cause you to experience some symptoms, to raise somebody you may know that has not really demonstrated any symptoms, or you haven't observed anything obvious to you suddenly starting to appear disheveled, or they're quick-tempered. These are all things that could be exacerbating that. And then there's just the overall cycles of illness. There may be a new diagnosis as we age. There are medical conditions that can make our mental health conditions worse. They interact with medications that we're taking. All of these things can impact a person's, how they're presenting at any given time. So if you're noticing a change in somebody, it may simply be that there are changes going on in their own lives that is just part of their chemistry as a human. There are a ton of external, and I could make this list even longer. I think the importance here is to see the external factors are far greater than the internal ones. Something as simple and complex as the weather. So having somebody who is having to live unsheltered, or spending more time outside or in severe weather can exacerbate those conditions. Certainly something serious like a loss of income or housing or health insurance can really be an external trigger. Changes in their provider, even if it's by their own choice, any change can be triggering. There can be transitions. Providers may decide to try a different medication, or there may be a time between when they can get in to be seen. And so they're going a longer period of time without being seen that could impact them entirely outside of their control. Basic interactions with others, as I said, living among humans can just be triggering. Certainly an acute episode of trauma, or just the ongoing trauma of experiencing homelessness and not having control over many of the factors of your life. An episode of incarceration, whether that be have an impact on medication or not, but just the change in environment and the stress and trauma of that. And then disruption of routines. People experiencing homelessness very often depend on that routine to know what they are going to be able to access at any given time, to try and feel some control over over aspects of their lives. So this disruption in routine can be very triggering for somebody, especially somebody with serious mental illness. We're going to now delve into the de-escalation. So de-escalation, that's a big term that really just means the reduction in the intensity of the conflict or the crisis episode. It's a combination. We're going to talk about strategies, techniques, and methods intended to be used to decrease or reduce a person's agitation and aggression. So these are skills that are going to be helpful for you, regardless of whether you know the person is living with mental illness, whether or not they may be, they may not be, they may be, and you don't know it. These are useful tools just for working and living and interacting with humans. So hopefully this is going to be something that is useful regardless of what your work does, but is particularly, I'm going to make sure that we talk about the impact on people living with severe mental illness so that you can see it through that lens and apply it to the people you may be working with. So the goals of this, we want to keep people safe, both the person in crisis, those around you and them, and you. You know, I think sometimes when we work in homeless services, we often part of what leads to burnout is the fact that we feel like we are giving, and putting other people's priorities, and we want to help people move out of their situation. And absolutely all of those things are true, but your safety is also important. And there are ways and important strategies that can, I'm never going to say guarantee, but that can improve the likelihood that everybody comes out of this safely. So you want to assess for what level of care is necessary. It may just be that this person needs space and they are going to run their course and be okay just with given a safe environment to experience their crisis. Others are going to need a level of intervention. So we're going to talk about how you can assess for that. So, and if they do, you want to support that person until the appropriate professional help arrives. So we do not abandon people, even if you are not licensed. So remaining with them in a safe way until the necessary professional help arrives. And then this is a little bit at the end or the tail end, and we're going to talk about reintegration, identifying changes in behaviors before they become a crisis. So often frontline staff, whether you are security or shelter staff or work and drop-in centers or community health workers, peer navigators, however you identify yourself and what role you play in your system, you very often are the ones who know individuals the best. And so you are going to pick up the changes, however subtle or large they are, and can help implement or help get professional help before it becomes an acute crisis. And this is really the goal, because every crisis situation that a person has, particularly when living in with severe mental illness, it can be very traumatic for them. It can be more difficult to come back from, meaning, they said medications, when you go on and off them, can be more difficult to being able to safely find what is the best combination of treatment for you moving forward. So identifying those changes in behaviors and intervening before they become an acute crisis can really make significant impact on their overall treatment. So it doesn't require to be a trained professional. You're going to see, we will be sending out these slides. So there are links. You can become a trained crisis intervention specialist. It is not a licensure or affiliated with any particular degree you have to have, but it's actually an intensive training, several day training to become a crisis specialist. I highly recommend organizations invest in this and consider having a few staff become trained in this, because then they can train colleagues, but you can have identified leaders when crisis situations happen. But we are going to give you some tools that, regardless of whether or not you get that training, you can feel more equipped to respond to these situations. So you don't need to know exactly what's going on to be helpful. This can be difficult and frustrating sometimes, but you don't need to know those labels or tags. that this person has bipolar or that this person has a personality disorder in order to be able to be helpful. You need to be able to observe what's going on and make decisions that are based in keeping people safe. So focusing on the safety of everyone involved. Seek out trusted relationships to make a person feel safe. So if you see somebody having a crisis situation and you know they have a particularly close relationship with a case manager or with a security guard or with the staff in the cafeteria, seeing those trusted faces, not that that person has to be an active participant in de-escalating the situation, but simply seeing them and being able to recognize somebody that they know and trust can be very grounding for a person. So having that person present may be able to de-escalate the situation just by their presence. And you, as I said, you may be the first and best person to notice these changes before the crisis becomes acute. Never underestimate your relationships with the people you serve. They are the backbone of any treatment. And so you are no less important than their doctors, than their psychiatrists, than their therapists. And in many ways, they may view you as a more significant or more important person in their life. So we're going to go through a bunch of slides. I'd like you to just think, as we go over these next slides, think of a crisis situation that has occurred on your job or that you were either responsible for responding to or observed. So I am confident that this has happened to everyone. And I want you to think about who responded, who helped the situation. Conversely, maybe were there things that happened that heightened it, that made it worse? What strategies or interventions did you see? I'm going to help you put some names or language to some of those strategies, but that doesn't mean that they weren't happening or that even if you didn't know what it was called at the moment, they very well may have been implemented. What was the follow-up after the incident? And another, if you could do it all over, or what did you learn from that and learn from today that you would want to see done differently the next time you have a crisis situation in your work environment? This is another training that I highly recommend you all to consider attending. So mental health first aid is specifically for non-licensed individuals to be able to be supportive to somebody experiencing a mental health crisis. I've done the training. It is absolutely fantastic. I will tell you I actually happened to take the training after I became a licensed clinical social worker, and what you are learning in this training is exactly the best practices that we know to be true, with more money being spent on a clinical degree. So really, really useful, effective, highly implementable skills that are taught during this training. But just say they use this action plan called ALGE. But so you are going to assess for risk of suicide or harm. So just assessing for harm in general. So mental health first aid is really geared to somebody who is experiencing a crisis situation where they are identifying suicidal or homicidal ideation or thoughts. But that doesn't mean that it is not applicable in a lot of other ways. So you want to listen non-judgmentally. We're going to talk a lot more about what that means, how that plays out. You want to give reassurance and information. The next slides, we're going to walk through some of that, how we talk to people, not just what we say, but also how we say it. Definitely encouraging appropriate professional help. This may be a decision, particularly if you are in a workplace where you have to make that decision and initiate it. Obviously, this is in the context of it can be used both in a professional setting and in a personal setting, the way the mental health first aid training is designed. So we're going to, the crisis intervention steps that we're going to go over next are going to focus more about in a professional setting. And then the follow-up, kind of what we call is the reintegration, is encourage that self-help and other support strategies. There's a lot of treatment options when a person is a post-acute crisis on how they can seek ongoing care if they don't already have it. So there are 10 of them. So you will, as I mentioned, you will get these slides, but these are incredibly helpful de-escalation tips that can be used in all settings. This will work if you have a crisis in your family, but we're going to talk about it from the lens of working in a professional environment. So the first is to be empathetic and non-judgmental. So this means that you do not dismiss a person's feelings. What is happening in these moments is far more about what the person is feeling than it is about any other truth that is happening. In particular with severe mental illness, you need to remember that the person may not be aware of what is going on. Something I should have mentioned when we talked a little bit about symptoms. Those symptoms are not always noticed or recognized by the person. So certainly we think of this when a person has psychosis. Sometimes the person knows they're hearing voices and they're really scared of that, and it is terrifying for them and they don't want to feel that way. Other times the person may not even realize that they have separated from reality and may not really be aware of the other people in their environment. But this happens a lot too with depression and bipolar. Those are often gradual. Symptoms don't, it is rare that somebody wakes up and immediately feels a severe level of their illness. It very often is a gradual decline in how they are feeling and a gradual increase in their symptoms. So they didn't just stop bathing entirely for a month in one day. That happened gradually. They found it more difficult to get out of bed and slowly started to eat less. And then they found it was longer between times that they were going outside and times that they were showering and taking care of themselves. Also, on the other end, when somebody is experiencing a manic episode, which is the other end of depression for somebody living with bipolar, they don't realize that their speech is pressured. They may not realize that they've been sleeping less. They may feel very productive until it becomes a problem. And that is very often the case. Also, that feels very good in contrast to the depression they might have been feeling. And so that desire to be as far away from the depression as possible, because of how miserable that felt, can often result in them not having a really great awareness of what's going on. Respecting personal space. So not just that you are sharing space with them, but how you do it. So thinking you do not want to square your shoulders to somebody. You do not want to stand with your arms crossed. Those are all viewed as threatening postures. So turning to the side, maybe not looking directly at them, standing in a relaxed position where your hands are visible, and that you are talking in a level tone. Another thing to note is you may need to give them more personal distance, more personal space. They may come closer to you, which can be very intimidating and feel very threatening for you, but they need more space. So their actions do not necessarily reflect what they need. So they may be coming closer to you, but you need to give them a wider berth. The other thing of this is, when possible, eliminate spectators. Especially as somebody starts to de-escalate from their crisis, embarrassment, just kind of remorse, all of those things can come into play. They may have unintentionally hit someone. All of those things can happen during a crisis. And so the more things and people you can remove to give them space to feel what they are feeling is really showing how you value that person. Using non-threatening and nonverbals. So very often when a person is in crisis, they don't really hear you. They hear your words less, but they see your movements, they see your facial expressions, and they can hear the tone in your voice. So you really want to try and remain neutral. Don't have fast movements. If you are in a space, not having a lot of people coming in and out, that makes them uncertain of what is happening behind closed doors or in other spaces. They are very self-centered in these moments. A person is very self-centered and so they assume that everything is out, it is a direct result of them. And really, I have a dear friend of mine is like, you got to manage your face. So just being conscientious of how your eyes are looking. I mean, if you're making faces like broad eyes and like, clenched teeth or angry snarls, they are going to read that far more than they are going to hear whatever it is you are saying. So trying to keep your emotional brain in check. So remaining calm, you stay rational, you stay professional. Nothing that is happening here is personal. This isn't about you. I can't emphasize that enough. And this is not an opportunity for you to assert any dominance. That is not the goal in de-escalation. It can feel like it is, particularly if your job is of security, where you depend on that authority to manage your environment. This is not a time when you want to be asserting that. That will very often heighten and exacerbate things. You can't control the person, but you can control how you respond to them. So not being conscientious of your own personal triggers. What's frustrating to you? Maybe even having to step out if a certain person is in crisis. This is why it's so important to have multiple people who are trained in crisis intervention and respond to a situation at a time, because you may get into an environment and you may know that person really well. You may be related to them. It could be that that person reminds you of a family member, and it is very triggering for you. We are all humans. We have lives outside of our work. We need to be cognizant of how that might impact us on any given day. You could have had an argument with a family member, and this person says something so similar to what that family member said to you this morning before you walked out the door, and you just can't contain your response to that. You need to be able to know that and remove yourself and say, this one's not for me. I can't be the one to respond right now. And focus on feelings. As I said, this is not about you, and this isn't really about what they are saying. Very often a person in crisis can say hurtful things, will say things that don't make sense, will say things to try and get you to respond or to try and get you not to respond in a certain way. So you want to use supportive phrases that let the person know that you understand that this must be scary for them or that this must be frustrating. It doesn't mean that you agree with how they are reacting or that what they are saying is true. You're not saying, yes, there are people out to get you. You're not, in doing that, you are not endorsing something that you know is not true, but you are joining them and supporting them in a way to try and make them feel less alone. Talking a little bit about power again, really ignore those questions or challenges to your power authority. They might say things like, you can't do that, or you don't have the authority of this, or anything that they might say. Try and ignore those challenges without ignoring the person. It is a lot more difficult to do in some situations, depending on how a person is responding. If people feel differently to a person who is in severe depression than they do to somebody who is in psychosis or bipolar, because very often something like depression or suicidality is more readily evoke empathy and concern for the individual, whereas bipolar and psychosis can evoke frustration, and just difficulty managing. And so it is really, important to try and put yourself in check and ignore what is coming at you and focusing on the person. So trying to, when possible, set limits, but respectfully, simple, give concise choices, try and give a choice, and speaking in ways that are clear, simple, and try and offer that positive choice, the best case scenario for the person first. So if you've identified that this person does need to go to a hospital, then it is important to try and introduce that topic as quickly as possible, in a way that makes it sound like it is what you know to be true, which is to be in their best interest. Especially depending on your role, you probably have a lot of rules that you are supposed to be enforcing. Think about what might be negotiable at this moment, what options you can give them to make it so they are able to de-escalate, just calm down a little bit. And then allowing the person some time and space and a chance to reflect, and very much physical space to decide how they're going to proceed. Allow every amount of time you can give. increases the chances that this person can de-escalate a bit on their own, because staying in crisis mode is not, the body can only sustain it for so long. So the more you can create a safe environment for them, the more likelihood that you can help them get to a level where an intervention can be safer for them, by creating that environment. Then, as I said, just kind of giving them that space, that a person who is upset cannot make decisions quickly. They feel rushed, they feel pressured, and they feel like you are judging them based on what their answers are. After a crisis situation, it's really important to think about what reintegration is going to look like. It is so important to provide non-judgmental support for the person who experienced the crisis. So whether this be somebody who had to go to the hospital or had a period of inpatient time, if they are returning to your organization, so they're coming back to reside in this shelter, or they're returning for meals or case management services or whatever, healthcare, whatever it might be, reaffirm that they are still welcome. Minimize the casual conversations about the incident. So if that person wants to talk to others, that is entirely within their right. It is not somebody else's right to know what has gone on. They may need to have some conversations to be able to re-engage in your services safely. That might be something that you as an organization have decided that you need to have a conversation with them before they re-engage in services. So you're not going to have no conversation, but you want to make sure that it is not viewed as this incident that they are identified by, and that is going to follow them for the duration of time that they access care at your location. And you want to collaborate with them to develop a plan for prevention. So very often a person, after they've experienced an acute crisis, is able to talk about what went wrong, or maybe they've learned some things as they got treatment that can help them better address what they experienced the next time it happens, or as they start to notice an increase in symptoms. So try and plan for that when it is not a problem, so that you have an agreed upon plan that is identified by them if it does arise again. And hopefully it's something you won't need. It is so important to debrief these incidences for all staff who were involved, witnessed, or know the individual. So it could be that there is somebody who works closely with them that wasn't there at the time, but might feel very strongly about what happened. So debriefing is so important. It also sets a norm for your organization, that you do this regardless of what the incident is, big or small. This means that you care about talking about the what, so like what actually happened, what events happened, how did it transpire, and then the why, and then the how people are feeling about it afterwards. What could we do differently? What did it trigger for you? What is it that we need to consider for the next time that something like this happens? It can be helpful to have somebody come in actually to manage these debriefings, particularly if it was a very intense situation. Certainly if there was a severe outcome, somebody needing long-term hospitalization, or God forbid death, but it can be very helpful to have that external support. Staff will move at their own paces, and it is so important not to judge what they are doing and the rate at which they are going. You may say, well, they weren't directly involved. They didn't have to do this. They didn't even see it. You don't know what happened in their life that this could have triggered for them. And then having that organizational plan for coverage for staff. So you all, if you are not in a position to be making those decisions, advocate for this for yourselves, that this is a reality of working in homeless services, of caring for individuals with severe mental illness, that you will experience, witness, be a part of crisis situations, and there needs to be a plan for you to be able to take good self-care, and that may mean needing to be out of the office or out of the location for a period of time. My last 2 minutes here, I want to just kind of wrap up these. We've covered a whole lot of information, but just that couple key takeaways that I want you to have. Serious mental illness is like any other health condition and should be treated the same. Please, please, please work on the stigma in your communities, in yourselves, in your organizations. Serious mental illness, all mental illness is like any other health condition. Conditions go on or undertreated and underdiagnosed among people experiencing homelessness at very high rates. This is going to make crises more likely and potentially more challenging when they arise. De-escalation is about fostering a safe environment and getting an appropriate professional on site to support the person or getting them to an appropriate professional. And then intentionally care for everyone after the incident. That is so vital, to care for the individual who was in crisis, the people who responded, the people who witnessed. Life is challenging, and we need to foster community in order to be able to respond to these incidences. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I don't think I missed any. A lot of good ones. Yes, definitely get the slides. They will be sent out to you. I think I need to resend because I added one trigger. The trigger slide was a new ad, so I'm going to send those out. But if you don't see it, that one's not a huge slide. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. I'm so grateful and wish you all the best as you enjoy this entire training series. I'm so excited for you all and all that it is lined up for you. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for being with us today. We greatly appreciate you and the time that you took out of your day to join us for this series and this presentation. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us today and being a part of this wonderful series. And I, of course, have to thank our sponsors again, Anthem Medicaid, for making this all possible. We will be hosting more upcoming series, including a harm reduction that will be presented by some peer support specialists from our community. So please be on the lookout for that registration link. All slides and the recording link should be emailed to you automatically as a follow-up along with the survey. If not, please reach out to myself or Erica Johns at the Coalition for the Homeless, and we can get you the materials and recording link and anything else that you're in need of. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.